PBRs. An example of one that I was referring to is where a woodworking manufacturer making cabinetry, making all kinds of different cabinetry for all kinds of different operations, had to worry about also, distance to off-site receptors. And there's areas where you're filing for a PBR that is the industry specific, the activity specific, and then don't forget you've got this other issue about, well, what about affecting off-site areas, especially for those businesses that seem to have a community relationship where you're embedded inside a residential neighborhood. And we've run across those before. You've got to worry about a PBR that addresses the off-site receptor being that school or that neighbor nearby. And what about those emissions, and not so much even the wood emissions that are maybe housed inside a building, but well, you're drying that material, right? So maybe you've got a small little boiler and you've got that little stack out there, and does that really have to be captured into a PBR? And the answer, it does. So you've got at least two there for just a simple operation, and possibly more depending on what they do with the wood itself. Are they using hand tools? And there's a PBR for that. So you can have 3, 4, 5, many different PBRs for just one site.
For hand tools.
For hand tools. I'm not kidding you.
Wow.
And the corollary to this whole thing is, if you're developing a new process at an existing site, or you're building a brand new site, it's very, very important that you look at things stepwise in your process and identify potentially PBRs that are associated with each individual step in your process.
And I think it's something that really not overlook, but certainly on the same slide, if everyone sees it, is this idea that the hierarchy within Texas was done with some great planning, and that PBRs do need to be, and I think the term is rolled into other higher level permits that you acquire as you get bigger and stronger marketplace, and your business grows, and you have emissions that now break a threshold, which means you're jumping into different permitting obligations that way. Well, these PBRs stay with you, so you just roll them into the next phase of where you're going to, and so the PBR may exist. It certainly stays registered in the TCEQ database, but they're now become part of your overall site permit for your new source review permit, or whatever permit you're trying that you are obligated to have.
And so this is probably a silly question, but does each PBR, are they catered to the facility, or is it pretty much just a blanket facility? Like like you said, I have some hand tools. Well, will there be a PBR that with an exception rule on that too, or is that a separate rule altogether as well?
Well, typically PBRs address a specific process. So you would have a PBR for a boiler, you would have a PBR for hand tools, you would have a PBR for welding, and there's a slew of them, as you'll see on the next slide.
Okay.
So they're not site specific, they are very process specific.
Okay. Thank you. That at least explains it to me. So, which is going to bring us to our first poll question. So our first poll question is, in Texas, the last count of available PBRs is A5, B27, C 108, or D over 500. So we'll give them a few more minutes to ponder that. So it shouldn't take long, because we did lose half of our audience when we had the technical difficulties. But so I think we've probably given enough time for everybody to. So I'm going to. Oops. Nope.
Maybe you could see the answer if you were to be so visionary.
Exactly. Now this is a day of
technical
difficulty for sure.
I like it.
It's kind of crazy. Okay, so the answer is, anybody want to know? Anybody want to take a guess on what everybody said?
I'd say we better be in the high 70s to 90s.
It was 88%, so that's pretty good. So 13% said over 500. That was kind of a trick, because we kind of said, gosh, there's so many of them. When you threw in hand tools, they're like, good grief, do I need a air permit for I don't even know
Leaf blower.
Leaf blower.
A leaf
that's right.
blower?
Yeah.
Yikes.
Yeah.
Okay. There you go.
Don't start going down areas we don't need to go down there, Mike.
So how do you qualify? So yeah, what
Yeah, so let's, you get to the point where you realize I got a need for a PBR, and it's like, well, how do we get to the next level, and what do I need to do next to get there? Well, part of everything else starts with qualification through thresholds that lead you to the next level of permitting. And even though you're starting at the base level 0 with a PBR, there is a top level, and if you exceed that, then you kind of have to go to the next level of permitting. And so there are some certain criteria. So the first thing you have to do is look at that activity's got to match the PBR. Is it listed in there? And the good news is the list that TCEQ has developed is you can do it by activity, you can do it by numeric lookup, you can do it all kinds of different ways on their website, and it identifies it. And then the trick becomes qualifying it with an emissions issue, which is always the harder part for everyone to understand, because it's your simple operation actually may be more than some of the thresholds that they've put out for these criteria pollutants that are trying to control that way. One thing that it occurs to me when we look at matching a PBR, we had an occasion to do a recent project where we thought we could utilize the activity-specific issue. And it turns out that the smaller criteria came really to play a much more significant role. In other words, the facility itself was meeting the definition of supplying this industry-specific operation. And when in essence, the better way to do it, and it really came from TCEQ giving advice back to us as we worked through the issues. And the facility certainly was very patient with us as we worked through it, because we did not have a good criteria. And sure enough, the better way is to go after the multiple PBR setting instead of trying to comply with the overall facility specific setting. And we can kind of get to that as some further examples, but in essence, the qualifying criteria meant that they met the thresholds easier, especially for VOCs and particulate matter, or the PM issue. So then that vein, it was really, we did the emissions calculations for those specific things, and they easily met those criteria, whereas with using a facility-specific, industry-specific PBR, it would have been a little more complex given the federal criteria for that roll into some of these angles. For instance, the MACT regulations, the 40 CFR Part 63 regulations that talk about maximum achievable control technologies and things like that. Because you still have the obligation in Texas to look at federal, as well as what the state's doing. And the PBR just means that's how you register, but you still better need to look at all that stuff.
You may have already answered this question, but does one or the other, does the federal trump the local or the state? Or are they kind of similar?
Kind of riding down the same path. I mean, at least the way I look at it. What do you think, Mike?
Well, I mean, you can use the PBR permitting scenario here in Texas, but if you go through the checklist, you have to make sure that you're addressing all of the federal requirements that might be applicable to a specific facility. And the one that comes to mind is surface coating. In some instances, even though you may not be a major source for HAPs and be able to use a PBR, you still might have to meet criteria under the federal surface coating regulations. So when you submit an application, there are two different kinds of PBRs. There are kinds that you claim and then kinds you register. The registered PBRs have to be submitted to the TCEQ for review and approval. and that is a list of, a very partial list of registered PBRs, and you can see on the bottom that one of them is surface coating. So, like I said, even though you can use a PBR to permit a surface coat facility, you may still have obligations with respect to compliance as regards certain federal regulations for surface coating. So when you develop the PBR, you have to tell the TCEQ how you're going to achieve that compliance.
Well, I have a question from the audience. Would this be a good time to ask? So what are my options if I want to use the 106.261 PBR, but I am less than 100 feet away from another facility property line?
Well, it's kind of a convoluted question, actually, but I can see where it comes from, because in TCEQ's PBR system, you're actually looking at not only distance to the property line, but also distance to the receptor or the source, if you will, to the property you don't own and or the emission source you don't own. So if you're trying to qualify yourself as to register to 261, the TCEQ wants to know, number one, how far away is the property line, that other property, but also where is that source in relation to your sources? And when you draw that line, that's the property or little distance limitation issue that's really most adhered to. But both are required, and both have to be put on the checklist and submittal.
And the other thing that kind of underlies that whole discussion is the fact that you don't want to be creating a nuisance condition with your process. So sometimes distance limitations are, very important, especially when it comes to odors and things of that nature. The other thing is obviously health effects. Sometimes you're constrained in terms of the distance between your process and, what might be impacted by it, specifically, individuals, that type of thing. So the distance limitations that TCEQ is embedded in, particularly in 261, 262, are very, very important.
Okay. We have another question from our audience. I have a small paint booth at my site, and I do some painting and some sandblasting. What PBR would I need to use?
There are, in fact, actually two separate PBRs, one for surface coating, and there's actually a couple of surface coating PBRs. Those typically address paint booths and the requirements associated with operating a paint booth. And then there is also a separate PBR for blasting. So in this particular instance, you would need 2 or 3 PBRs.
I totally agree. And the hardest part about that kind of issue is there's more things that you could be doing with your painting something, and especially with a paint booth, that might be additive to the whole PBR setting. And we've discovered that as well in doing, walkthroughs of the process with folks. As you walk through, and then they call us up perhaps with a need to have that paint booth, got to get a permit because somebody told me I need that. And sure enough, you walk through and you find out, well, gosh, they're also doing some allodyne coating, which is nothing more than an etching with an acid. Maybe they're also evaporating, you doing some heating with a steam source that's coming from a combustion unit. Well, there's your combustion unit. There's your 106.183 issue. So you've got a couple different areas where the actual PBR that drove them there might be actually the one that needs to get registered, but oh, by the way, you may need to claim 3 or 4 others just because they are activities that are going on at the same facility.
Well, wow.
Yeah, it's different, and I'd say, the unregistered PBRs are really the bulk of what needs to get done. And are you, one of the questions that might come up, and I know we've had clients ask the same question, am I at risk of TCEQ doing an audit on me and or maybe even a complaint, heaven help us, to kind of, it shows here's a TCEQ auditor or agency rep at my doorstep, and and they come on site and they see I've got woodworking and I've got a combustion boiler that's over 10 million BTU an hour, and I've got all these different sources, and what happens in that whole thing. And the good issue is that most areas, certainly in my most experience here is with the Fort Worth office in that region, there's they take the time to get the personnel on the site to understand why a PBR is necessary. And in a lot of cases, if it's a claiming a PBR only, then they'll actually help them and say, well, you're claiming it now, and I'm going to help you through that. Oh. And it's a great thing. And then they may reach out to us to say, well, what do I need to do after that? And those kind of things. But
they're so nice at the TCEQ. That's really nice.
They're beautiful people.
Okay, so when I saw this slide, I actually, how do you have an unregistered permit? Because you would think that by just having the permit, it would be, by definition, would be kind of registered, right? Or am I, so what does that mean?
Well, on a certain level, the people at the TCEQ are very trusting people.
There's no sarcasm in that, Mark, by the way.
No, there are, once again, it goes back to the one of the very first slides, and that is the PBRs themselves, if you read through them, are very prescriptive. And the individual PBRs will tell you whether or not it needs to be registered with the TCEQ. I threw this one up here, or actually selected these because these are typically things other than the boiler that people tend to overlook at their facilities, especially when it says cooling water units. Those are actually cooling, that refers to cooling towers. And I've had a number of instances where I go on a site, I'm walking through the site, and I said, well, you do have a PBR on the shelf for your cooling towers. And I get the whole deer in the headlights look. Degreasing units, those are the little ones that Safety Clean comes and changes the fluid in like once a month, that type of thing. Those, you don't have to register them with the state, but you do have to have in a binder on the shelf. The last one I find kind of remarkable is you can permit a small water treatment or wastewater treatment package unit with a permit by rule. Now, obviously, if you're in a larger facility that deals in petrochemicals and you have a pretreatment system, that type of thing, you have to take a very careful look to see, what your VOC emissions are, your HAP emissions are, and things of that nature. So you may not necessarily qualify for it.
On that point, Mike, if you don't mind, even a recent entity we helped out, indeed, a petrochemical facility found out that indeed the wastewater treatment system was a PBR of all things, and yet certainly the facility was a Title V. They had 2 or 3 NSR permits, these higher level, highly developed type permits, and here was this wastewater treatment system that met the PBR. So it's quite possible to do it. And it's worth looking at, and it's all about qualifying, and do you make sure that the emissions from that area actually trigger or don't trigger a higher level permit than the PBR.
Okay, so here's just another layman question. So do you ever go out to a facility, because whenever I hear you need multiple permits, I'm thinking that's cha-ching, that's more money, that's something that I need, just going to come out. So is there ever any situations where you've gone out into a facility and actually saved the money by different things, or is it just, no, sorry, go directly to jail?
Well, nothing really comes really directly to mind that way, especially on this side of the desk and all. But because if there was an agency rep at the door and was discovering those things, I think there's a big effort within Texas to make sure that industry is at least stewarded the right way, because the issue is not penalizing. The issue is just recognize the obligation and then begin to practice it, because the issue then is a benefit in the community primarily, as I referenced before. So I can't say that there's been an issue where we rescued someone, but certainly we've stewarded them in the better direction, and maybe even identified other liabilities, if you will, that they didn't recognize, that were in large part results going back to claiming things. And the hardest part about that is understanding that there's just still work to be done. Yeah, you can go claim something, but you better have some evidence to prove it. And that really gets down to being able to understand what are the emissions, what are those sources, and begin to identify them. And even that issue is beginning to take a higher level of need at TCEQ's permitting group. They're looking at things like ensuring all the sources are identified, and maybe you have what's known as an EPN identification, emission point number. And a lot of people are saying, well, I've only got the one source. Well, maybe, but it really just requires sometimes that scrutiny.
Good grief. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. Okay, so here's some recent examples that you guys wanted to talk about. There was a natural gas processing facility. Who wants to take that one?
Oh, that one's mine.
Take it, Mike.
I had a very large industrial client come to me, and they wanted to build a greenfield plant, and they wanted to create 100,000 barrels per day of liquefied natural gas. So when we first started the discussion with them, the first thing that pops into my mind, 100,000 barrels, I mean, that's a lot. It's 42 gallons a barrel, so big facility. So, we dug into the process though, and lo and behold, there is a PBR that we used for the main part of the process for the facility, and that's 106.352. And we knit a couple of other PBRs into it. They had a boiler, they had a recip engine, and they had a couple of other things. But we were able to permit that whole facility under the permit by rule program, brand new facility, greenfield. And it was registered with the state. It did have to undergo state review, but we submitted the application, and it was pretty thick. It was over 120 pages, something like that. But the TCEQ went through it, and we got the registered PBR for the entity in about 2.5 weeks.
So that facility had one PBR?
No, it had multiple
okay,
PBRs.
Sorry. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and on the aircraft facility, that was we do a lot here in North Texas with aircraft, and certainly Lockheed's a nice facility over in Fort Worth, and of course the Alliance Airport and its activities going forward. I'd say that there's sometimes not a well understood use of terminology. Aircraft facility means what? I mean, certainly the picture, gives you the idea about, we all know what a plane looks like. We've got the wings and we've got the fuselage, the body, if you will, and the different out structures. But what about the insides of it all? And I'm talking about everywhere from the wing capacity and then building a fuel storage area inside that, as well as even the engines themselves and the rest. And does that aircraft facility do those things? And oh, by the way, it's a hard challenge to find the word aircraft in the PBRs. So what am I left to? Well, there's another word called aerospace that kind of comes into play. And aerospace sounds like you're talking rockets and you're talking NASA. And okay, that fits. But it also is the aircraft side of it too. Okay. So it really gets to what's the right message, what's the right thing, and you've got a couple choices. And these people did. So in fact, in their facility, they were working with aircraft and aircraft interiors, in fact. And much of what was being talked about was, well, they meet the criteria for all these different aerospace PBRs. But at the end of the day, it was a better fit to go with the standard operations or activities that they were doing to do those internal parts and pieces that way. So quite a different approach, and certainly keeping TCEQ in the mix is part of the whole process to make sure that that we've submitted this application, but maybe we need to go a different direction, or maybe that's not quite the best approach. And like I said, we get not only the advice from TCEQ, but sometimes provide that back to them to educate them about what the industry is.
What's been the most unusual facility that you've found you needed to do a PBR, but you never would have thought it needed one? Has there ever been any surprises where you're like,
it's the 108 PBRs. I mean, when you think about it, when you think about even animals and pet shelters, and what about zoos and other aspects? Is that a PBR? And just a question out there, if you think about it, well, come on, it's a zoo. It's a animal shelter. And the answer is it's a PBR. So
what about farms?
absolutely. So all of those PBR livestock facilities, livestock auction facilities, animal feeding operations. There's a whole slew of PBRs addressing virtually, and I think that, to TCEQ's credit, and maybe we'll go beyond 108, but they've captured pretty much everything you could think of. It's going to fit somewhere.
Right. Okay, so what to expect? What do you guys? Who's going to check? Does the TCEQ, the EPA, But we'll go to our next slide.
Well, I think that the hardest part about that, when you start talking about a PBR and registering one, or and you flipped ahead there, my friend.
Oh,
accidentally.
my bad.
That's right. The hardest part about it is understanding that or whether you're doing registration or not, you still have to meet the criteria. You still have to prove it, and sometimes that proof isn't asked for right away, and sometimes the effort behind seeing that proof is sometimes with an inspection in mind. So having the evidence, and what we try to advise clients is, let us provide that evidence to you. Keep it in the files to show that indeed that's the operation, and that's kind of where it begins.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. The thing that I find kind of amazing to this day is the fact that certain clients, I mean, you go into their facility, and now granted, they look at their operation from the standpoint of making stuff. Okay, how much stuff can I make, and what's the best way to do that? And they don't necessarily look at it from a compliance standpoint. So you have to have a really deep understanding of how your process works so that you can identify the potential for emissions, and then you have to knit those together with perhaps the best PBR, to address that. So in terms of what can you expect, you need to really expect to take a deep dive into what you do, because you got to look at it from more than the standpoint of making stuff. And, I understand it's keeping your business going, being profitable, get that, okay. But there is a compliance and risk mitigation component.
And really, to that end, the registration of a PBR kind of gets you in that process thinking it. And it's not a bad thing to go through the registration process, even though it might be just a claiming issue. Because if nothing else, you identify so much more. And getting back to some of the elements of what that registration is all about, the way we pursue it is is to describe what the process is that you're doing, and what the intent is of the business. How you're going to what you're doing to make all that good money, but also what the process is from a flow chart and a classic block flow diagram that shows all the different ins and outs of where things go, with enough detail that allows the permit engineer at TCEQ to register it and understand what's going on.
And that kind of speaks to the bullet points that are on the slide. Especially when you're submitting a registered PBR, you kind of have to remember that you're going to submit this to the agency. It's going to go to a permit reviewer, and he's basically going to go into his or her review cold. So it's really important that you put a little narrative on the front end of it to tell him or her why you're submitting this, what the ins and outs are of the process, that type of thing. And that really is separate and distinct from the process description, which is the technical description of what they're doing. Is it a thermal oxidizer? Is it a boiler? If you're putting in a bag house, what's it collecting? Things of that nature. And then you have to go through and you have to crunch the numbers to demonstrate that you're below the 106.4 emission limitations, for instance, which is the umbrella that is spread over all these PBRs. And of course, then there's a crap load of paperwork on the back end. There's a bunch of administrative forms. There's PI7s, PI7 certs. There's a multitude of different things. And then the one really nice thing, or another really nice thing about the PBR program is that if it's a registered PBR, and even for some of the unregistered PBRs, the TCEQ has developed individual checklists that correspond with each PBR, and it walks you down through all of the pertinent issues so you can check each box so that when it does go to the agency or does go in the binder and go on the shelf, you can have a higher level of comfort that you've addressed all the issues. And the last item is we affectionately call it a Mayer table. And Don?
Yeah, well, so in the area of emissions, when you start to calculate those things out, if you've got limits that become enforceable and you need to follow those things, then the table becomes critical to at least displaying those things in a nice, easy fashion. That given the target element and how many pounds per hour, how many tons per year you're allowed to discharge from that process you've gone through, and you do that through the emission calculations. But the merit table is the annual emissions rate table that they've put out, and they ask you actually to develop. So when we put that together, helping a client, we're actually getting a chance to create the table that everybody knows about. And you talk about the cooperative effort of this program. That's one of the examples of it. We're actually, they will take what you have displayed and it's worked into these numbers. And of course, math has got to be right. But if you're in with everything else, qualifications to so many tons of VOC, for instance, and you're under that 25 tons, well, then you get a chance to at least display what's your emissions going to be annually. And that is what they're looking for industry to help them with. I wouldn't say it's new, but it's certainly more requested than ever.
Yes, I was just going to interject that we're seeing TCEQ require these merit tables, or say Form 1A, much more frequently than we have in the past. So it's becoming a bigger and bigger component, and it'll have some more significance when we pop onto the next slide here. So,
all right. So once it's in place, what then?
Well, then it's up to you. It's up to that industry to ensure that compliance is maintained, because it's a permit, so it has some teeth. You need to follow what the program talks about. So record keeping, Mike, this whole thing of record keeping is really tough for clients.
It is very tough, and typically all of the stuff is dumped on the site EHS person, and he or she, it's like they tear their hair out trying to figure out how they could demonstrate to an inspector that would come on the site from TCEQ that they're in compliance. And in certain instances, or actually in a lot of instances, I will tell that compliance person that you don't have to do this all yourself. What you have to do is you have to put systems in place with the support of your management to involve people like purchasing people, so that you can identify, how much fuel did you burn a month or a year? How much solvent did you buy? How many gallons of paint did you buy? And how many tons of waste or pounds of waste did you send off site. So when it comes to compliance and record keeping, it can be a lot more than, or it will in most instances require much more participation than just at the EHS compliance level. You have to, in most instances, involve people at a lot of different levels in your organization.
Well, you said a mouthful. I'll tell you, there's so many times when I was working with the other side of the desk and realizing what we needed in the EHS department to kind of ensure the not only the myriad of reports to do, but even just to ensure a PBR was maintained. To say, okay, purchasing every year, I'm going to need this, or we expect you guys to get certifications from the natural gas company that's supplying our natural gas and that it's burning in our boilers, that it's got low sulfur in it. I mean, it's a requirement. So who's going to do that? Well, many people can't go take a sample of that gas and test it, especially when it's actually being tested already. So get that cert from the natural gas supplier and let purchasing do all that for you, and voila, you've achieved compliance. But you need to put your hands on it when someone comes a call and asks that question. So it's a very difficult thing to concern yourself with record keeping, especially if you haven't done it. And certainly we can walk people through the different things, the issue of what do you record and what's a compliance activity and how do I know what to do?
So you can help them get those systems in place.
Exactly.
So
and in a lot of ways, the checklist kind of helps you with that. But better than that, going into the regulation itself. And what we try to do is give our clients, the upfront, before even the PBR is even made an application, it's like, this is what you're complying to. These are the regs and these are the compliance activities. Everything from, oh, by the way, you're going to register this paint booth. Well, that's great, but you can only paint in the paint booth, and especially while the paint booth is running. Okay, so what is that? So you're actually thinking about, do people actually just paint inside the booth without running the filters? And the answer is, yeah, they do. So there's specific requirements in the PBR that says to qualify, to maintain this PBR, you need to do these, what seems to be automatic, but sometimes not so specified things. And they try to take the obligation and say, let's make sure that occurs. So it's a trickiness.
So it's not just a permit, it's also an operating procedure.
Indeed,
cases, yeah.
Indeed. So there's a lot, and there's many of those. So you've got compliance activities as you've got the record keeping as well. And I think that just gives you a good sense about how at least a PBR can be a benefit, but it also brings to mind this issue of, I've got compliance obligations. And that's a good thing.
Okay, so very good. Good information. I learned a lot. I don't know about the audience, but I learned a whole bunch about
crowd's going wild.
PBRs.
Thank
Yes.
you very much.
the ones that stuck around, thank you for sticking around. I do have a couple more questions. We have a few more minutes, so I'll ask them as quickly as I can. So one of the questions is, I have an ACI, an air current incinerator, and according to my permit, it says visible emissions shall not be observed leaving the property, and best management practices should be used to ensure smoke and ash dust are minimized. Can you explain what exactly they mean by visible emissions?
Well, a visible emission is what you see coming out of the top of a smokestack, okay? The only thing that doesn't count with respect to visible emissions is uncombined water vapor. Other than that, anything that you can see coming out of a stack is a visible emission. Now, at the risk of diving too deeply into the weeds here, there is a procedure to assess the intensity of a visible emission, and that's from EPA's Method 9, okay? And basically, we here at W&M, we send people to smoke school to be able to get certified to assess the degree of a visible emission, and it's usually on a percentage basis. So if you look at a permit, it'll say you can't have more than 15% opacity, visible emissions, for a period of more than 6 minutes. So that, I think, kind of gives you some insight into the whole visible emission question.
Yeah, there's another method that is sometimes specified, and it's not often. Method 9 certainly is the one where you actually have to be qualified in smoke school, but another one allows you to not be qualified. It's method 22, but it has to be specified that way, and it has to be recorded. So you've got a couple different angles, couple different ways of looking at it, because you can't necessarily view things on a cloudy day where it obscures what a particulate matter looks like coming out of a stack. Weird things like that, and so pay attention to what the compliance requirement is. That'll dictate what you have to do.
Okay, last question. My facility has a few TIG welders on site. I'm being told I need a PBR. Is that true? And I would imagine if you have a hammer on site, you need a PBR because I've learned that today.
The answer to the question is yes.
Okay.
There is a welding PBR, and I'll fess up. I had to look up TIG before the webinar here.
So did we all.
So did we all. It's tungsten inert gas welding, and it's a specific process. But yes, you do. And actually, this kind of brings to mind another consideration, and that is, especially on the welding and grinding side, not a lot of metals, but certain metals will contain what they call the RECRA 8 metals, which is cadmium, lead, and 6 other ones that I can't bring to mind right now. But certain facilities have annual emission reporting requirements called toxic release reporting. And even though the welding PBRs is a claim PBR, so you just put it on the shelf, you may have to do record keeping with respect to the amount of welding rod or wire that you use over a period of time, because it may contain metals that you have to report under another regulatory program.
And in fact, to that point, on the welding PBR itself, it's talking about lead and restricting the amount of lead. So how do you, again, prove your innocence to that? Well, guess what? If your substrate you're welding with only has a low amount of lead, well, the maximum lead amount over a year might be the limitation you have, or might prove the fact that you don't have any lead at all, and what do you know? You comply with the PBR. So.
Okay, well, there you have it. So I would say this brings us to our last slide. So I would say, when in doubt, call Don or Mike or even Brandon. They know, they have the questions, they have the answers, or at least they have the books that can find the answers for you.
Sometimes we have lots of other questions.
Yeah. So, but thank you guys. Great information, and thank you to our audience for joining us. Apologize for the technical difficulties, but of course, this is our last webinar of the year, and of course, we have the technical difficulties on the last one. But we will be putting out a list of webinars that we'll have in 2018. You guys have a great afternoon. Thanks for joining us.